In hip-hop, the art of the cut and scratched hook, hereafter referred to as the cut and scratch hook, which usually comprises vocal snippets from songs, can be considered as a token of respect for the sampled act's quote-worthiness, an acknowledgement of one's highly acclaimed status in the game. For instance, when Swiss Beats inserted Jay-Z vocals into the choral sections of T.I.'s Bring 'Em Out in 2004 and Cassidy's I'm a Hustler in 2005, fans perceived it more or less as a confirmation of his legendary stand-in in hip-hop. Back when DJ Premier popularized and perfected the cut and scratch hook in the late 80s and early 90s, he often drew from artists such as LL Cool J, Big Daddy Kane, and KRS-One. But this time, 1994's Mass Appeal was different. The latest recipient of Primo's benevolence was neither a peer of his nor some wizened old-school pioneer. No, folks, this time he was scratching in the voice of a 13-year-old. With his voice committed to wax, Corinne Goodman became the youngest rapper to have his vocals scratched into a record. But still, he was a mere kid. Was the tyke that good? Or was Primo simply incorporating the line to fit with the theme of the song? Well, for reasons too elaborate to explain in further detail for fear of digression, it's advisable to lean toward the former. Here's the thing. Try finding a trio of children in their early to mid-teens throughout history that had the skill and maturity to develop deliveries that belied their ages. Now, until someone can prove otherwise, these kids get the benefits of the doubt, just like the legendary producers who would sire their future beats did, including DJ Premier himself. Just one question though. Who exactly are the youngsters? It was time for Lawrence Goodman, soon to morph into LG the Teacher, to make good. By 1981, he was out of jail, ready for a new venture that had been ignited in him by a fellow inmate, who happened to be a DJ. Those days of being associated with Black Ink, also known as the Philly Black Mafia, were over. He was now going to establish and commandeer his legit hustle, Pop Art Records. Perhaps it was best to start with what was most familiar to LG. Fellow Philadelphian Ron Akins had also been an inmate. A promising singing career with a band at the height of the Philly soul era, cut short by unknowingly, according to him, having relations with an underage girl. Incarcerated between 1974 and 1976 at Graterford, Pennsylvania's then largest maximum security prison, Akins became the lead singer of a band named Power of Attorney, which scored a Polydor Records contract due to a cosign by James Brown. Yes, that James Brown. And after regaining freedom, Akins was keen on resuming some sense of normalcy in his recording career. It could have been a cool redemption story. Ditto to Major Harris, a former lead singer of the Delphonics who, as well as a subsequent solo act, had mostly run dry since 1975's Love Won't Let Me Wait. But Philly soul was no longer the future. Hip-hop was. 1984's Roxanne's Revenge, that 12-inch answer record that birthed Dissin' on Wax and launched the career of Roxanne Shante, the genre's first female solo star, came through pop art. Another answer record, 1985's The Showstopper is Super Fresh, which gave the group that later became Salt and Peppa and their producer, Herbie the Love Bug Azar, their initial exposure, came through pop art. The debut of some of the future members of the Juice Crew, such as Craig G and the aforementioned Roxanne Shante, came through pop art. The first wave of Philadelphia's hip-hop stars in the latter half of the 80s, including 3 Times Dope, DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, LG's nephew Steady B, and Cool C. Those last two will forever be linked to infamy. Whew, long story. Were either managed by, produced by, or had material passed through pop art. By the end of the 80s, LG was firmly established as not just a record company owner, but also an artist manager and record producer. The truth is, much of Philadelphia's early hip-hop, and yes, a significant chunk of New York's 80s hip-hop as well, does not exist without LG, the Goodman family, and Pop Art Records. And with such a reputation, there was no lack of aspirants knocking on the proverbial door of LG's West Philadelphia headquarters. Emmanuel Parks, going by the moniker Mentally Gifted, had already cut his teeth working with LG on Cool C's second album, 1990's Life in the Ghetto. And now, the multiple threat, he wrote, rapped, produced, and cut and scratched, had a song entitled Something for the Youth, with he and LG behind the boards. But Mentally Gifted was not destined to record it. Feeling that the song needed at least a person who could fuse the song with a more suitable, youthful exuberance, Parks suggested that LG bring in one of his sons, particularly one who demonstrated the most interest in his father's business affairs. At 13 years of age, Karan Goodman, who had first made his appearance in the hip-hop world in the music video for his cousin Steady B's Sirius in 1988, was 6 years younger than MG. So, down he tumbled into the basement, where recording a few vocals morphed into recording an entire verse. Turns out that months of practicing lyrics of his favorite rappers in front of a mirror had panned out. Pleased with the results, LG decided to call down Karan's older half-brother, 14-year-old Taji Goodman, who happened to be in the house for the weekend, and who is also in the Sirius video, to rap a second verse. And that was when LG believed he had a gold mine of a rap act in his hands, and decided to round it up with a third member. Although 15-year-old Tariq Dawson was Karan and Taji's cousin, he felt more like a brother to them. He covered the third verse to complete the recording of the song. LG befittingly named Karan, Taji, and Tariq the Youngsters, and the song title will be slightly altered to reflect the stage name of the newly minted trio. The Youngsters was the first act classified as kiddie rap, hip-hop music performed by children, characterized by themes that would not feel out of place in a Peanuts comic strip. That definition and standard disqualifies MCs such as LL Cool J and Special Ed as kiddie rappers. They were both 17, closer to Mentally Gifted's age than any of the Youngsters, when they released their first albums, and their material was consequently PG-rated rather than G-rated. Either one exploring more mature topics wouldn't come across as phony. LG's mission, though, was to get his sons and nephew across to a larger company for their foray into largely uncharted territory. There was already a sort of blueprint to follow. Another Bad Creation, a new jack swing group out of Atlanta, had scored the platinum debut album with Coolin' at the Playground, earlier in '91 with 2 top 10 pop hits. And a few of the group members were younger than the Youngsters. Being on pop art was out of the question. For all its reverential status in Philly and a little beyond, it was still comparatively a tiny local office. The Youngsters was initially signed to Philadelphia International Records, the company that birthed the Philly soul era, using acts such as the O'Jays, Soul Train theme performers MFSB, Billy Paul, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, the Stylistics, and Teddy Pendergrass as its sterling conduits. But it was almost immediately clear that Philadelphia International's specialty was soul music, not hip-hop. Plus, it had seen better days. Eventually, it was East West Records America that decided to bite, after President and CEO Sylvia Rhone was impressed with the Youngsters' performance in her office. It helped that Rhone, appointed to head the company the year before, was well acquainted with LG's local exploits. After all, Cool C had been signed to East West's parent company, Atlantic Records. Plus, she had just signed another rap act, Das Effects, part of a larger plan to appeal to a wider audience with radio-friendly tailoring. Some of the recording for the Youngsters' debut album took place at the Gamble Huff Studios. It was symbolic of the trio's hometown heritage, since it was owned by the namesake songwriting and production duo, consisting of Kenneth Gamble and Leon Huff, that developed the Philadelphia soul scene in the first place, through the Philadelphia International Company that they co-founded. The song that the Youngsters recorded was released as a single later in '91, and their debut, adopting the name of the Mentally Gifted song that turned out to be their first single, dropped on March 10, 1992. With Karan's tone in the middle of Taji's comparatively shrill voice and Tariq's slight tenor, all three boys spit with the confidence and maturity of seasoned veterans. Credit goes to LG, MG, and the title track, which bookends the album with a funkadelic breakbeat-fueled version on one end, and the New Jack Swing iteration on the other. Listening to each youngster doling advice on parental guidance and reminiscing about more carefree times, some may almost think that the much older mentally gifted eventually found himself behind the mic and delivered the verses in 3 different voices.
There was a time I used to wish I was older, so I could look over my own shoulder.
Say kid, how old are you? Same goes for the far less subtle Rufus Thomas sampling Reminisce, which conjures the atmosphere of a 70s predominantly black sitcom theme song. Here, the boys are unintentionally hilarious as they recount their childhood exploits as though they are in their 20s.
I was worse than a baby kid, but I still had more good times than JJ did. We didn't mean any harm, we were kids having fun.
No, really, how old are these guys? Street Smart, which primarily relies on the warm, welcoming chug of the Gap Band's Shake, finds the youngsters lecturing their peers about avoiding the pitfalls of the hood, thereby making them razor sharp and possibly primed for an environment as cutthroat as showbiz. A lot more convincing to swallow, in fact, closer to the adage, be yourself. Songs like Yeah, You're Trying to Play Me and I Didn't Mean to Break Your Heart, another New Jack Swing number, are appropriately about sweet puppy love. Cartoons is probably the most impressive of the 11-cut set, bubbling with childlike innocence as the trio name-checks their favorite animated shows and characters. It sounds like a charming, personalized 20th century encyclopedia of American cartoons, and rated PG cannot be any more apt.
Parental discretion is not advised. You don't have to cover your ears and close your eyes. But this is RATEDPG.
Yep, it sure sounds PG too. But despite the youngsters' precociousness on the mic, they could have done with better beats. Of course, not to totally blame their father. He produces the entire album with Mentally Gifted, who wrote all the lyrics, for anything extreme. A few of the beats are pretty good. Cartoons, for instance, beautifully veers from a whining siren-filled section, thanks to ESG's UFO, to its funky drummer backbone interspersed with Amen breakbeats loops. And the Boast Fest in Tough Cookie is duly complemented with a Kool and the Gang fused jazzy backdrop of resounding bass and cymbals, and laced with a Big Daddy Kane hook. However, save for the New Jack Swing feel of I Didn't Mean to Break Your Heart and the remix of the title track tagged at the end, the latter which sounds like the basis interpolation of the Gap Band's Outstanding and is co-remixed by DJ Eddie F of Heavy D and the Boys, the album feels like an endless stream of steely break beats and funky thick bass lines. The board work is not bad per se, but it fails to arouse any significant auditory jolts or oral excitement. And as for the youngsters, even their skills fail them in a song like Neighborhood Bully, where what should have been a very amusing tale of a schoolyard terror instead turns out to be quite a bit of a bore fest. The greatest travesty, though, has to be Pass the Mic. But wait, isn't that the song that contains that immortalized line mentioned earlier? True. And isn't that the song that became a Billboard Top 10 rap single? If you're referring to the famous Outstanding Pete Rock remix with the requisite horns courtesy of Lou Donaldson's Pop Belly and bubblegum sweetened stomping drums of Tommy Rose Dizzy supporting the occasionally Daz Effects inspired rhyming from the youngsters, you know, the version that DJ Premier actually sampled about 2 years later. Well, no, it's not on this album. The original is, though, with different and remarkably inferior Taji and Tariq lyrics and a drab backdrop largely carved from a slowed sample of Rufus Thomas's Do the Funky Penguin that tries to rise with kinetic energy. A disappointment, really. The Quran bar is still there, though, and Mentally Gifted is present in both versions. It may have not mattered, ultimately, if the youngsters had broken through with their debut. Instead, Something for the Youngsters failed to make it onto the Billboard 200 chart. Or any chart. And that colossal failure was only compounded by the arrival of another teenage rap act from the same Atlanta area where another bad creation, the Youngsters' Teen Idols, hailed. Totally Crossed Out, the debut album of Criss Cross, appeared in stores 3 weeks after that of the Youngsters, after both LPs were recorded in and around 1991. A month later, its first single, Jump, which had been released back in February, had climbed up to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, and it would stay there for 8 consecutive weeks. Jump's monumental success would propel Totally Crossed Out to the top of the Billboard 200, and it would remain there for 2 consecutive weeks. By the end of the year, Criss Cross had a 4X platinum album that was still in the top 10, a double platinum single with Jump, a gold-certified top 20 pop single with Warm It Up, and a third Hot 100 hit with I Missed the Bus. Forget being the biggest kiddie act around. They were arguably the most successful hip-hop act of 1992, and one of the most successful acts of the year, period. And there was one final twist of amusing coincidence. The guy who mainly penned Criss Cross's lyrics and produced their beats was also a 19-year-old. From then on, the Youngsters' commercial potential was perpetually challenged as they struggled with how to balance entertainment value and their mainstream aspirations with the growth and maturation of their craft, minds, and bodies. Granted, one could argue that few, if any, in their age brackets rapped as good as the Youngsters. Plus, Something for the Youngsters holds some historical significance as the first kiddie rap album. But it wasn't like the field was crowded in 91 and 92, and it would take more than a mostly undistinguished effort like Something for the Youngsters to rise from the doldrums of anonymity. In other words, they still had a lot of growing up to do. Well, outside of that, past the mic line, of course.
Once again, I reveal the skill. Money's going like grass with the mass appeal.
Thanks for watching. For those new here, welcome to Rap Perspective. For the Rappleheads, I greatly appreciate your support. Don't forget to like, comment on, and share this video, and make sure you subscribe to the channel. And I encourage everyone to watch, like, comment on, and share other videos on here. See you in the next video.